Quick, describe your character. How's it going, everybody? My name's Joe. Welcome to Tabletop Theory, where we talk about educational theory and counseling theory and how putting those things together can help make you become a better GM, DM, storyteller, role player, and all of those things. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a sidestep away from the educational and counseling theory, and we're going to talk a little bit about something that everybody eventually has to do whenever they're playing a role-playing game, and that's describing their character. Describing your character sometimes gets overlooked, and that's okay, but it's still an important step for you, the creator of this character, to actually get a chance to explain who this character is briefly to the other players and the GM. And whenever you're introducing a character for the first time, or maybe transitioning an old character from scene to scene, your GM may give you the inevitable chance to answer the question that we all love to answer. Describe your character, although that's less of a question and more of a statement. Some players may feel a little nervous or overwhelmed when they're tasked with describing their character for the first time, but that's what I wanted to talk about today. I've seen it done for a long time, and I've done it myself a number of times, too many to count, and I've learned a few things along the way that I feel like would be pretty helpful to new players and maybe even some older players to understand the vagaries and nuances of describing a character to other players and a GM. And remember, the more thought and planning that you can put into something like this, the more likely it is that you can save yourself the chance of being flustered or overwhelmed whenever the GM eventually does ask you to describe your character. Additionally, if you do think about what your character might look like when they're first introduced in a scene or the first time during a game, it can give you a chance to get a little bit deeper perhaps into some of the psychology of who your character is and what they're trying to represent about themselves. The format of a character question takes a lot of different forms, and this one is the one that I found to be the most helpful for me, but it may not work for everybody, or you might already be doing something exactly like this. As always, take what you need and leave the rest. What I'm trying to encourage here is a format of character description that I've seen and used over the years that I find to be very effective. It's about between 1 to 3 sentences where you get in, explain your character, and get out. Just short, punchy language. So what I wanted to do is try to describe the different things that could go into that 1 to 3 sentence description and what to leave out of that description. All of the different things that go into how a character presents themselves is something that you and the character potentially do have some control over. Things like how they dress, how they walk, how they act, their general demeanors, idiosyncrasies. All of those different little pieces go together to make a puzzle that eventually comes up to represent the character that you're trying to create. Oftentimes, outward appearance says something about the character beyond what they say about themselves. Somebody who may want to present themselves as being wealthy or disciplined may have very straight posture. They may speak very eloquently with a lot of very clear diction. They might wear clothes that are well tailored. They might have a very expensive perfume that they like to wear. The simple descriptor can go beyond "she wears some fancy clothes" to "she wears a tailored silk coat." Basically the same amount of words, but a lot more description between those two things. Alternatively, a character that has a very talented martial artist might move with great economy. They may not waste any motion with additional gesticulation, like I always do. I tend to talk with my hands. The other thing to understand about describing your characters sometimes is trying to avoid the mundane can actually be pretty helpful to your description, because chances are there's a lot about your character that's probably pretty unremarkable. So if you describe your character as average in height or weight, then chances are you probably don't really need to describe that unless you're describing a character who is so beyond the pale in terms of their average and mundaneness, is that a word? That you probably want to actually bring that to someone's attention. If you're playing Shadowrun and everybody's walking around with these incredible cybernetic limbs, and then there's Jim over there standing in the corner just wearing a white button-up shirt, needing a haircut and maybe a tie, and looks kind of just like an average dude, maybe that's out of the ordinary for that particular group, but that isn't necessarily what I found to be the case with most players whenever they create their characters. Most of you, and myself included in this, are creating characters that are exceptional in some way. If you go back and think about all the villain stuff that I talked about, we create villains to be exceptional, and oftentimes we create the adventurers or the heroes of our stories to be exceptional in very similar ways. If something is considered to be a basic fundamental feature of your character's ancestry or race, then chances are you don't need to go into an excruciating amount of detail in order to describe it. Most dwarves have beards. Most tabaxi have fur. Most vampires have sort of a pale complexion, and they don't really have any kind of flush of humanity in their skin. So if you end up playing a tabaxi with no hair, a dwarf with no beard, or a vampire that actually gives off heat and looks like they're breathing, those are some mundane things that you could potentially describe. But if you're talking about a dwarf with a beard, you don't really need to go into all the detail about that dwarf's beard, how long it is, and what color it is. The other thing to remember is that it's okay to be vague about certain things, because chances are when you meet a new person, you're probably not going to recognize the fact that they are 6'4", but you're probably going to recognize whether or not they are taller or shorter than you. So when you're describing your character, you don't necessarily need to give a bullet point description like you're reading off of a rap sheet. You don't need to describe the fact that your character is 5'8" and 130 pounds. It's not necessary, because whenever we as humans meet other humans, we're not getting that type of vital information, and you can save it for later whenever that information may be relevant to your GM or to another player. For example, if another player's like, hey, how much does your character weigh? I want to see if I can throw them. That would be a relevant time to divulge that kind of information. But when you're giving your initial character description, nobody really needs to know how much your character actually weighs in pounds or kilos. The other way to try to understand how your character is going to be presented is to really go down the 5 basic senses. So sight. A lot of the time, that's pretty much how a lot of people end up describing their characters. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's how most of us that can see gauge other people or other things. They gauge levels of comfort or threat based on how they look. But the sense of sight doesn't necessarily have to dictate all the information that you're going to provide about your character during their initial type of description. Moving on to something like smell and taste, those two things are linked because oftentimes our sense of taste is dictated by our sense of smell. Now, I'm bringing this up because I think it's important to know that most of the time you're probably not going to know what the other characters you're playing with taste like. But it's still an important factor to bring up, because in some role-playing games like Werewolf the Apocalypse or Vampire the Masquerade, the element of smell and taste are actually very important to playing the game. Most werewolves get their sense of sort of understanding of a character, be it an NPC or a player character, based on how that character smells. Most vampire characters get a sense of another character based on how they smell and whether or not they're able to be hunted or killed or drank for blood. And if you're playing a shifter in Dungeons & Dragons, chances are that sense of smell is something that you may rely upon as a player to try to give your character a little bit of extra depth whenever they're interacting with the world the GM has created for you. And the thing is, sometimes smells can tell us a lot about characters, trying to determine whether or not that character is wearing perfume or cologne, whether or not they smell like bleach, or whether or not they bathe regularly or don't bathe regularly. All of those pieces of information can actually provide really valuable nuggets of character description if there's something you feel like you want to include. So when you're actually taking a moment to think about how your character might be described whenever you first introduce them, maybe spare a moment to consider how they smell. Now, sound is something that some players do have a little bit of difficulty with, and some GMs have some difficulty with, because when I think of sound and character description, the first place my mind goes, at least, is to trying to attach an accent or a different voice to this character whenever I'm interacting as a GM as opposed to interacting as a player. Sometimes I'll throw an accent on it, and I really don't know what the hell that was. But the point is, you're trying to add a silly voice to it. That might not necessarily be something that you need to do all the time, especially if you feel like it's something that you might have difficulty with. The thing is, sound doesn't just apply to how a character speaks. Sound applies to a great deal of different things that your character may be carrying on around them, or just how they move through the world. There's a big difference between how a character wearing heavy armor walks compared to a character who is designed for stealth and quietness, or maybe politeness. If you're dealing with a face in Shadowrun, they probably walk very differently than something like a barbarian in Dungeons & Dragons. And describing how they sound whenever they're walking around is a very important amount of description that you can add to your character. Additionally, the different clothes that your characters wear, or the different gear that they have on themselves, can actually add to that additional part of sound that you might want to add to your character's description. Because if they're walking around, like I said, wearing full plate armor, that stuff clanks and bangs, and it's loud, it makes noise. Leather jackets crinkle. Fabric gets nice and ruffly and makes sort of a swooshing noise if they're made of high quality things like silk. All of those different elements can really add to that sort of symphony that your character plays as they walk around wearing armor, or wearing leather armor, or just wearing a nice tailored suit whenever you're trying to describe them for the first time, because all of those different sounds tell something about your character. One of the last ones is touch, because it's, again, kind of tough to describe how something feels whenever you're describing your character for the first time, but you could spare a moment for it. Using adjectives like sharp or rough or dirty can actually make a huge impact on how different players, the GM, try to interpret information about your character. And finally, the last one that I want to bring up is the idea of instinct. Now, instinct is something that isn't necessarily one of the five senses, but the idea of trying to get a general feel is something very different, because it's not necessarily something that anybody can put their finger on, like how something looks or how something smells. But everybody kind of knows what I'm talking about. If you're in a situation where you meet somebody, sometimes they might creep you out, or sometimes you might get the feeling that they were going to be your best friend immediately. The thing is, that type of instinct is something that you can include in a character description. Now, a good example of something like this, I was racking my brain trying to figure out how best to describe this. It would probably be to take a certain actor. Let's say Jason Momoa. Now, Jason Momoa has played quite a few different characters, but most of the time, because the dude is shredded, he doesn't wear a shirt. But if you look at a character like Khal Drogo, and you look at a character like when he played Aquaman, those are two very different characters, but both of them kind of spent a lot of time walking around without shirts on. If you look at Jason Momoa in both of those roles, you kind of get the feeling that what he's providing on screen is a presence or an instinct that you can pick up on as an audience member to try to really get your head around the idea of who this character is and what they're about, beyond just how they look and how they sound. Because getting that sense of instinct or ease or unease across to the other players or the GM is a really important part of trying to display who your character is. If they look completely normal and mundane, that's one thing, but if they make everybody feel ill at ease, that's a very different thing. Trying to understand what that instinctual response would be to your character is something that can be a little bit tricky, but I think it's also something that can be a little bit rewarding if you want to take the time to investigate it. The last thing I want to mention is the rule of three. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it's something that I found to be pretty helpful. It's the idea that you really don't want to draw attention to more than three things about your character, because chances are the players and the GM aren't really going to remember everything that you describe. So whenever you're creating a character description for the first time, don't necessarily spend a lot of time describing everything about your character from top to bottom, because chances are no one's really going to remember it. And that's not meant to be an insult, it's just meant to be truthful, because when you meet somebody for the first time in your life, in the real world, you're probably not going to remember much about that person beyond the fact that they might have been taller or shorter, what their skin color might have been, what their eye color might have been, maybe, I don't remember eye color, and what their hair color might have been. All of those different things really get stuck in our mind because chances are they're the things that we recognize the fastest. Now, when it comes time to actually trying to remember those things about your character, those basic elements are what the other players and the GM are also going to remember about your character. So remember, if you want to really take the time to describe everything about your character, that's fine, but maybe don't try to do it all at once when your character is first introduced in the game. So with all of that being said, let's go into actually what a brief, effective character description sounds like. So creating a first impression about your character is pretty important, because that's really the first time you're going to get a chance as a player to let the rest of the table know what your character is about. And the thing to remember is that you want to have short, punchy sentences that provide enough information that the other players will remember your character with the information that you've provided. Writing something in advance can give you the opportunity to really sort of filter out all the different things that you might want to describe about your character, but you want to narrow it down to the most important things that you want to describe to your table right away. So like I said before, you want to write up a brief description between 1 and 3 sentences that provides enough information about your character that the rest of the table can have some of that information and maybe have some interesting things that you might want them to ask about in the future. This isn't the time to go into your character's backstory or provide all the information that you probably want to about your character. There will be time for that later whenever that comes up in something like role-playing. But whenever your character's getting introduced for the first time, chances are you probably won't have time to provide all that because the other players want to be able to describe their characters too. So when it comes time to actually read the character description that you have, it's okay to actually have it written out. I've got one written right here that I'll read for you right now. Darius is a young man with pale skin and a slender build who smells faintly of bleach. He wears a baggy hoodie and cargo pants over very clean neon blue sneakers. Slouching against the wall with a shy grin on his face, he pulls a silver laptop covered in stickers from his messenger bag. That's pretty simple. It's 3 sentences. Now, I did provide a lot of information, and that could actually be considered to be on the long side. Darius is a character from Vampire the Masquerade that I've had for a long time. He's someone that I try to describe him as being a little bit shy and a little bit awkward, but he's a new vampire who was turned because of his expertise with computers. But since the other players don't know anything about that character right now, they're going to learn about him as the game progresses, because initial character description is not the time to give every piece of information about your character right away. That comes later. So when the other characters have their initial interactions with Darius, there's like 2 things that you might even want to talk with him about. There's his sneakers, which are meticulously clean, the fact that he smells like bleach, and the fact that he's carrying around a computer that's completely sticker bombed. All of those different things are vital elements to who his character is in the game, but I'm not going to go into a big long description about what all of them mean right then. The thing that's important about Darius is that you know enough about him to continue the game and let the other players actually give descriptions about their characters. Because chances are when the GM actually asks people to describe their characters, they want this to happen in a pretty quick and expedient manner, but they still want everybody to get the opportunity to share that information. So again, shorter can be better when it comes to this type of stuff, unless you have a GM that just wants everybody to describe everything in great enormous detail, which is okay. I'm just saying from my experience, shorter can be better. The other thing that's important is that Darius isn't really wearing anything or holding anything or in possession of anything that's super important. Something that I really guess you could call a pet peeve of mine comes down to the idea that a character is not their gear. Your character is a living, breathing person that has all kinds of idiosyncrasies and difficulties and successes in their past and maybe even in their future, or things that might be going on right then that whatever type of sword they're carrying really doesn't have a huge factor in it unless that sword has some kind of important element to their backstory. And when I provide a first impression of a character, I don't just want to be reading off their inventory. Yeah, he's an orc that has a battle axe, is wearing plate mail. I don't want to do that. 2 daggers, some rope, and a backpack. If that's how you describe your character, that's fine. With a whole bunch of flasks, but those are inside the backpack. Nothing wrong with that. It's just not for me. The thing is, whenever you describe your character for the first time, that's also not going to be the only chance you get to describe your character. As your character goes through their adventure and they get past the first session, past the 6th session, the 10th, the 30th, there's a lot of things that are going to happen. And if you're using systems that utilize things like experience points or levels, they're going to become more powerful over time, or they're at least going to have more experiences that give them different types of insights to the world around them. And the thing about those insights is that they can change how you describe your character over time. I know for Darius, when I first started playing him, he was a very different character than he is when I played him most recently. Because over the span of all the sessions that I played him, he underwent a little bit of a narrative journey. And the same thing applies to the characters that you're going to be creating. The narrative journey that they go on will affect how they present themselves to the world. And you get to decide what that looks like. And I think that's actually kind of a fun idea. Because as your characters go through the story that they're playing in and the things that they've been a part of, they're probably going to accumulate some interesting gear. And I didn't want to be super critical earlier, because gear does matter, because the possessions that we have as humans can, although it's unfortunate, define us sometimes. And the same thing can apply to the characters in your games. The important thing to remember is that if you want to describe all of the information about how your character changes over time, you should provide that to your GM. You don't necessarily have to tell them every little thing, but giving them specific pieces of information, like little pieces of description about certain items, can be very helpful to a GM that they might want to actually be able to use them in the future. So there's a few things that I feel like can change over time, and I wanted to point them out right now. The first one is gear. Gear is the obvious answer. As people go through their different RPGs like Shadowrun or Dungeons & Dragons or Star Wars, a lot of characters accumulate different items that can help them accomplish the goals that they've been looking to try to do during their actual adventures. But if those pieces of gear change, how do they affect your character? What do they look like? If you have new armor, chances are it looks a little bit different than your old armor. If you have a new sword, chances are it looks a little bit different than your old sword. Being aware of what those things are and how they look can be really helpful whenever you're trying to describe how your character might be changing over time. The other thing to remember is something like wardrobe or your hair or your makeup. Again, if you're talking about a character who's destitute and they end up getting some money, chances are they're going to put a little bit more effort maybe into what they're wearing or how they do their hair, if they do their hair at all. Or it might make no difference at all, and that could be something that could be a lot of fun to play with too. Currently, there's a player in one of my games that is running a character that has really no concept of what money is, and that character might be quite wealthy, but at the same time, they don't use it to affect how their character looks. They spend their money on other things in the game beyond just how their character portrays themselves, and I think it's a little bit endearing. The other thing that can be accumulated and change how your character looks over time are things like tattoos or body modification or scars. I've definitely had a lot of players come to me and say that their character wanted to get a tattoo after a certain adventure happened, or that they might have sustained an injury that left a scar, or they might have wanted to get a piercing that could be appropriate to the culture that their character is from. Those types of body modifications or elements and evidences of battle that have occurred in the past can be really interesting and really helpful in trying to give your players a chance to describe things about their characters that will change over time. And no matter what these differences are, you should write them down and let your GM know what they are. That way they can keep track of them and maybe use them against you, with you in the future. But again, if it's insignificant, like Darius's hoodie that I was describing earlier, you don't really need to go into detail every time Darius might change the color of his sweatshirt. But if he starts walking around in formal wear, that's a very different expression that Darius is putting out there into the world. Big changes warrant description, in my opinion. Small little changes about things like the color of a wardrobe, you can describe them, but remember, if all you're doing is describing the different colors that your character is wearing day in and day out, your other players aren't necessarily going to remember everything you've described. Short, punchy sentences provide a lot of information that other players can remember and that your GM can keep track of too. So here's two extra little tips that I wanted to bring up. This is some extra sauce if you really want to pour it on the idea of describing your character. Sometimes trying to describe a character and try to put across information about how they look is a little bit tricky. And this one can be used for players, but also for GMs. Because what I found to be helpful is that if I want to put across information about a character very quickly, and I don't necessarily want to take the time to describe a whole bunch of different little things about how they look, what I'll do is I'll go on Google and I'll look up a picture of an actor like Jason Mantzoukas or Ed Helms or Jason Momoa. The thing is, if you have those pictures at your disposal and you try to describe something like the Dockmaster and it says, yes, the Dockmaster walks up and they're wearing a ragged shirt and baggy pants and they look like Jason Momoa, and you just provide a picture of Jason Momoa, that's going to create a very different sort of gut level reaction on the part of your players beyond just they're wearing a baggy shirt and baggy pants and they have some tanned skin and a tattoo on one arm. That type of reference can be very helpful if you're also a player and you want to come up with sort of a look-alike of like an actor who would be playing your character if this RPG game that you're involved in was a television show or a movie that was being produced. The thing to remember about that though is that a lot of actors carry a lot of baggage with them. So if you're trying to create like a really super intimidating villain, maybe you don't necessarily want to cast that person as Nick Cage because, you know, if you're dealing with Emperor Palpatine as played by Nick Cage, that's not really intimidating, but it is really weird. The other thing that you might want to consider doing, and that I've seen other players, I haven't done this myself, but I've heard a lot of players get a lot about this, is the idea of creating a style book for your character. If you're having trouble trying to describe what your character looks like, or you want to feel a little bit more comfort in the idea of having some options for how to describe your character, going around and doing Google image searches, or maybe creating a Pinterest board of all of the different types of items or styles or pieces of wardrobe that they might be wearing could be very helpful for description in the future, because if you feel like your ability to describe things isn't necessarily where you want it to be and you want to maybe give something to the players or the GM that's a little bit more specific, maybe you want to go find a coat, for example, that your character is wearing. If you can find an example of that coat on the internet and maybe print it out or save an image file of it, and your GM's like, okay, what does your coat look like? You can just hand them that image file instead of actually going through the process of trying to describe what that coat looks like. Now, I'm a big believer in learning how to describe items and describe physical characteristics about your characters, But if that's not for you and you feel more comfortable trying to provide specific information, the way to sort of circumvent that would be to try to find images and sort of collect them in a style book of sorts for the character that you're trying to create. Because what's more fun? Telling your GM, yeah, my character's wearing fancy clothes, or showing your GM an example of a well-tailored jacket with ruff around the collar and saying, yeah, my character's wearing a very well-tailored purple jacket with ruff around the collar. This is what it looks like. And what you end up doing is giving your GM something they could potentially use in the future, like if they lit your character on fire, not that they would ever do that, and that fringe on the collar actually starts to burn, that's a very different experience than your jacket's on fire. Character creation is a lot of fun, and it's definitely something I've seen a lot of players spend a lot of energy and time on. It's a great way to express your creativity to other players and to the GM. And if you spend a little bit of time and a little bit of energy thinking about how you want to describe them, chances are you're going to be more prepared the next time your GM asks, describe your character. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here today and taking the time to kind of go down this somewhat simple but still very important aspect of role-playing games. Because character description, I think, is something that does get overlooked periodically, but it's still something that's a ton of fun. If you found any of these tips helpful, or if you want to provide other tips, feel free to leave them down here in the comments section, or you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe. I would appreciate it. And if you really want to encourage the growth of the channel, I would encourage you to hit the like button. Thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate you very much. My 6th grade English teacher, Mr. Patty, told me once that inspiration doesn't come before writing. It comes during writing. And he's not the only one who's expressed that idea. In his book on writing, Stephen King talks about the idea of letting inspiration find you. Inspiration isn't something that you can go and seek out, but you can be in the same place every day and let inspiration know where to find you. Being at his desk, being ready to write at a specific time every day. If inspiration comes, great. If it doesn't, that's okay. He'll be back tomorrow if inspiration wants to come find him. So if you find yourself in the middle of a creative block with writer's block or not being able to know what comes next, go through the process of just starting whatever you're doing. For me, it's writing. For you, it might be painting or creating a character. All of those different things will create inspiration for you, but it may not happen until you are already engaged in the process of accomplishing whatever it is that you ultimately want to end up doing. And I think Mr. Patty was onto the same idea. Inspiration comes during the process of creation. Seldom does it come before. I hope that piece of inspiration is as helpful to you as it was to me. Thank you so much for watching. Be kind, take care, and have fun adventuring.